It's my great privilege now to introduce three new speakers. I'm going to introduce them all together like we've been doing here. The first one here to my right is Anand Rambachan, who is professor of religion at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. He was also visiting professor at the Academy for the Study of World Religions at the University of Hamburg in Germany. His books include Accomplishing the Accomplished, The Vedas as a Source of Valid Knowledge in Shankara, The Limits of Scripture, Vivekananda's Reinterpretation of the Authority of the Vedas, The Advaita Worldview, God, World, and Humanity was the subtitle, A Hindu Theology of Liberation, which my students are reading right now in my doctoral seminar, and Essays in Hindu Theology. They're also reading from that book as well, okay? And most recently, Pathways to Hindu-Christian Dialogue. His scholarly interests include the Advaita or non-dual Vedanta tradition, Hindu ethics, liberation theology, and interreligious dialogue. Dr. Rambachan is a highly sought-after participant at various conferences around the world involving religion, including at the Vatican. He has presented at Notre Dame many times over the years. In fact, he is presenting at 2 different conferences at Notre Dame this very weekend. Can you imagine this? The other conference being offered by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. I think this is a first at Notre Dame to have a person speaking at 2 conferences in the same weekend. So I wish I had your energy. Second, the second person is Swami Medhananda. He is a monk of the Ramakrishna Order and senior research fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. Okay. He was previously associate professor and head of the program in philosophy at the Ramakrishna Mission for over a decade. He earned his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He also studied in Berlin and at Oxford. He's the author of 3 books, Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism, I guess I got that right, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, and the Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Reevaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno. One of his books, just mentioned, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, has brought him to the forefront of scholarly discussion on comparative philosophy and epistemology. The book has been widely reviewed and acclaimed. Swamiji is also the editor of the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta, co-edited with Benedict Gurke. And let me see what else I have. He is also the editor of 2 special issues of the International Journal of Hindu Studies, one on Vedantic theodicies, and one on Swami Vivekananda as a cosmopolitan thinker. He's the section editor for the International Journal of Hindu Studies, overseeing submissions in Hindu and cross-cultural philosophy of religion. And I'm just not going to list all the other articles and places he's published because we'll run out of time. And then our third speaker is Jeff Long, Dr. Jeffery Long, who is the Carl W., well, in German it's Ziegler. I don't know if you pronounce it Ziegler, Ziegler?
In Pennsylvanians call it Ziegler.
Ziegler, okay. Professor of Religion, Philosophy, and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, where he has taught since receiving his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. In 2021, his university gave him a major award for research excellence. He is the author of several books, including, fairly recently, Hinduism in America, subtitled A Convergence of Worlds, and Jainism, subtitle, an introduction. As well, he is the editor of Perspectives in Reincarnation. His works in progress include an introduction to Indian philosophy, consisting of both a textbook and a reader of primary sources, and also a work on the reception of the Upanishads through the centuries in both India and in the Western world. Dr. Long did his undergraduate degree in theology at Notre Dame before converting to Hinduism. Wow. He is one of the most prolific authors living in the West, writing on all manner of Hindu themes. One of Dr. Long's gifts is his ability to write simultaneously for multiple audiences, for both the trained scholar and the general reader. So let us now welcome Professor Rambachan, who's going to speak first.
Thank you very much, Brad, for your introduction. And thank you very much for all your hard work in making this conference an actuality. I'm grateful to be a part of it. I'll keep my eye on the clock ahead of me to ensure that I stay within my allotted time. So my subject today in this very brief paper is perennial philosophy and the non-dual Advaita tradition. The topic seems simple enough, except for the fact that Advaita, or the non-dual tradition, is a very ancient one with multiple interpretations even to this day. There are also many versions of the core claims of the perennial philosophy. So to avoid misleading generalizations on both sides, I want to just, in the first part of my paper, to clarify, first of all, the very specific stream of Advaita about which I am speaking, as well as the perennial philosophy that I bring into this discussion. I should say that the non-dual tradition is the focus of my scholarship, primary scholarship. It is also the focus of my personal religious commitment and practice. So the first is that the Advaita tradition about which I speak is an exegetical tradition that regards the Vedas as a source of valid knowledge. In Sanskrit, we use the word pramana, a source of valid knowledge. So this Advaita, as I understand it, derives its central teachings from a reading of the last sections of the Vedas or the Upanishads. And there are other authoritative sources. In fact, there are three central sources: the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutras. So it's a tradition that is constructed from a certain exegetical reading, interpretation of the teachings of these texts. Secondly, as already indicated, this is a teaching tradition. It's indebted to a lineage of distinguished interpreters. I speak of them as theological interpreters for the explication, the defense, the transmission of these teachings. The principal exponent and commentator is, of course, Shankara, who lived around the 8th century, and so he is the most prolific commentator on the Upanishads and Brahma Sutra, as well as Bhagavad Gita. I describe the Advaita that I profess as a teaching tradition because in the primary sources, the Upanishads, students who are in search of liberating wisdom, liberating teachings, are advised to approach a teacher who is knowledgeable about the tradition, who knows the tradition, who knows the sacred text, that the word that is used is Srotrium, but also one who is existentially rooted in those teachings, the one in whom teaching and being come together. One who knows is one who is. So that's the teacher that one is advised to speak. So what we see in the text is after a process of instruction, students describe themselves as free from self-ignorance. At the conclusion of the dialogue itself, knowledge is transformative, and it's a discipline of listening, of reflecting, of assimilating. While I identify myself as an Advaitin in the broad lineage of Shankara, I do not do so uncritically. And it's important that I say that. Although affirming a teaching that I understand to be fundamentally anti-hierarchical in its core claims, a teaching that I interpret to affirm the equal dignity of every human being, it is also true that while Shankara committed himself to these teachings, as many have observed, including Bhimrao Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader, Shankara also affirmed the essentials of a hierarchical social caste order, which was the prevalent context of his time. Many who profess Advaita, I must say, today still support and still affirm that hierarchy and still teach this tradition within the context of that hierarchy. With that, I very strongly disagree. Shankara, my difference from Shankara has another important point. Shankara is a traditional renunciant. He's a sannyasin, he's a monk. And he's one who has entered what we speak of as the fourth stage in the Hindu tradition, which is a rather radically consequential step. When one enters into the fourth stage or becomes a renunciant, as we will say, a sannyasin, one is exempt from traditional ritual obligations, such as daily worship at dawn or at dusk, or occasional worship, performing. We just had in the Hindu tradition the ancestral fortnight, making offerings on behalf of departed ancestors. One is completely free from all such ritual obligation. This is an implication of entering the fourth stage. But entering the fourth stage also frees the individual from having to fulfill obligations that are associated with what we regard as responsibilities to family, to commitment, to community, and so on. Renunciation results in the dissolution of marriage, in freedom from contractual debts, the distribution of property among heirs. There's in fact a very close resemblance between the rituals of death, when someone actually dies, and those that are performed to enter into the fourth stage. In fact, those who renounce include themselves in the traditional obligation made to departed ancestors. I say all of this to make the point that the identity of the reader or the identity of the commentator as a radical renunciant with a sole purpose, an ardent and a sole purpose of achieving moksha or liberation, informs the reading of the sacred text. Of that, there is no doubt. Now, when I read Upanishads, and I'm not reading these texts as a radical renunciant, I'm reading these texts as a professor, as a father, as a recent grandfather, as a husband, as someone engaged and committed into the world. I'm intrigued by the verses that Shankara does not comment on. I'm intrigued by what the commentator overlooks, the richness of the text. So what is very clear is a renunciant without social ties is likely to have little or no interest in the social relevance or the social implications of those texts, or even in the historical nature of the text. Having severed, as I said, familial and communal relationships, these are not matters of interest again for a reader. For me, they are. And I read the text with a different lens. So, as I will say a little bit later in the show, I also distinguish Advaita from dualism, from pantheism, also from panentheism, and perhaps most importantly, from illusionism. I might if time permits, I return to these distinctions later in my presentation. As far as perennial philosophy is concerned, I didn't know really where to start for this comparative project. So I limit myself to the exposition of Aldous Huxley in his well-known and widely read book, The Perennial Philosophy. And again, this is a very extensive work by Huxley, so I limit myself to a few themes within this larger work. Many elements of the perennial philosophy identified by Huxley in his famous work bear affinity with the claims of the Advaita tradition. Huxley, for example, titles the first chapter of his work, That Thou Art. In Sanskrit, well-known Sanskrit statement, Tat Tvamasi, which is taken from the Chandogya Upanishad, in fact, repeated at least a dozen times in the Chandogya Upanishad during the course of a discussion between teacher and student. So Huxley understands this great sentence. We speak of this sentence as a Mahavakya in Sanskrit, one of the great sentences of the Upanishads. He understands this great sentence to mean that the Atman, or the immanent self, is one with Brahman, the absolute principle of all existence, the ground of being. The identity of Atman and Brahman is what this sentence points to. So after citing and commenting very briefly on this sentence, a sentence, in fact, which has attracted, as you can imagine, extensive traditional commentaries. Shankara has a very elaborate commentary on this sentence. Huxley recommends 3 ways for coming to a knowledge of this truth of the identity between Atman and Brahman. I'm quoting now from Huxley's writing. He may begin by looking inwards into his own particular Tao, and by a process of dying to self in reasoning, self in willing, self in feeling, come at last to a knowledge of the self, the kingdom of God that is within. Or else, he may begin with the Taos existing outside of himself, may try to realize their essential unity with God, and through God with one another, with his own being. Or finally, and this is doubtless the best way, writes Huxley, he may seek to approach the ultimate that, both from within and from without, so that he comes to realize God experientially as at once the principle of his own Tao and of all other Taos, animate and inanimate. End of quote. This is the closest I found that Huxley comes to suggesting specific methods for the attainment of this liberating knowledge for him, the identity of the self with Brahman. Elsewhere, he suggests that divine reality may be apprehended by a mind in a state of detachment, charity, and humility. Such apprehension, according to Huxley, has a self-validating certainty. And Huxley cites Shankara often to justify his description of the perennial philosophy in the Hindu tradition. One of the significant problems of Huxley and Advaita, that I had to struggle with, is Huxley's homogenization of the Advaita tradition. I do not deny that Huxley, in his discussion of Advaita as perennial philosophy, offers a summary of a very popular strand of the tradition. It is well known that Huxley became a disciple of Swami Prabhavananda, a monk of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. And Swami Prabhavananda was the founder of the Vedanta Society of Southern California. And Huxley wrote an introduction to the Swami's translation of the Bhagavad Gita and contributed articles regularly to the magazine Vedanta and the West, published by the Vedanta Society of Southern California. He served also on its editorial board. But the problems of Huxley's homogenization of the Advaita tradition also extend to his homogenization of Advaita with other traditions to propose this perennial philosophy. There is a leveling process in this work, which I think obscures important differences and rich detail that matter very, very much. For Huxley, as I've said earlier, the truth of the identity between Atman and Brahman directly manifests in a mind that is quiet and detached, and it manifests with a self-certifying validity. It has epistemological authority. So this experience is authoritative, epistemologically so, and ego-destroying. What is different here is that for Huxley, there's no central role for the teacher. You can come to this experience simply by cultivating certain qualities of mind that include detachment, etc., as a result of which knowledge, with a self-certifying knowledge, manifests itself in the mind. I don't deny that there are certain strands of Advaita where that view is advocated. It is not the Advaita that I subscribe to, or to which I am committed. In the tradition that I live and practice and studied, the role of the teacher is indispensable. It is in a disciplic relationship that one learns, that one receives liberating wisdom, and not outside of this disciplic relationship. I'm not denying the possibility of it, but I'm just distinguishing it from other traditions. Because for Shankara and his immediate disciples, as I said, Advaita is a teaching tradition. Knowledge is imparted in a teacher-student-disciple relationship in accordance with methods enunciated in the Upanishads. And Huxley, of course, doesn't see the Upanishads as conveying a methodology of instruction. So even though he, speaks repeatedly of this central teaching, Tattvamasi, that thou art, there is no analysis of the long discussions taking place between teacher and student, between Aruni and Shvetaketu in the text at all. The methodology is a rich methodology is employed by the teacher to communicate this wisdom is completely overlooked by him, and just latches on to the statement, or the great sender's Maha Tattvamasi. So for Huxley and those who share his version of Advaita, there is a self-validating, self-certifying experience that legitimizes the identity of Atman and Brahman. For Shankara, on the other hand, and here's for me the crucial area of difference. For Shankara, knowledge, valid knowledge, whatever it is, whatever kind of knowledge it is, whether it is knowledge of the identity between Atman and Brahman or any other kind of knowledge, valid knowledge is only generated by a valid source of knowledge, a pramana. Valid knowledge is generated by a valid source of knowledge. There is a role there for experience, but experience itself is not an incontestable valid source of knowledge. It probably provides an opportunity, but it's not a substitute for the sacred teaching. So valid knowledge is only generated by a valid source of knowledge. And for Shankara, the valid source of knowledge here are the teachings of the Upanishads, transmitted from teacher to student. Why? Because it satisfies, a valid source of knowledge has to satisfy the criteria of a valid source of knowledge. One is that it must not be contradicted. We were talking earlier about consistency. Valid knowledge must not be contradicted by what we know of the universe from other valid sources of knowledge. So non-contradictedness is one of it is the fundamental criteria of valid knowledge. And this is why these commentators are spending lifetimes in exposition on these sacred texts. What are they trying to do? To show that the claims of these texts are not refuted, are not contradicted by what we know about reality from other valid sources. And secondly, a valid source of knowledge must have a unique sphere of a unique subject matter. So these are all very important epistemological dimensions of traditional Vedanta. For Shankara, the teachings of the Upanishads transmitted in this disciplic relationship are adequate as a resolution to the human problem of ignorance, of self-ignorance, because the problem is not one of bringing the Atman and Brahman into any kind of union, because they are never separate. Atman was, is, and will always be Brahman. The problem is one of ignorance. And Huxley, on the other hand, I don't want to read him too harshly or be rash to judgment, but speaks repeatedly of the necessity for union between Atman and Brahman. Whereas it may be just a subtle difference. For Shankara, that union is a fact. It's simply that we're not aware of it. It doesn't. There is no separation, spatially or temporally, between the Atman and the Brahman. What is to be overcome is the veil of ignorance, which is overcome by right teaching. Because the reality to be known, the existence, let me put it this way, there's this interesting discussion earlier, the existence of Brahman is not a matter of proof. It's not to be proven. Because Brahman is self-manifest in the very notion of one's existence. I am. As Shankara says, you can't deny the fact of your existence. It is a self-manifesting truth that I am. And that amness is, in fact, Brahman. So the problem is not to prove the existence of Brahman, but really, what is it? What is its nature? And for that, you need a valid source of knowledge. That valid source of knowledge is the teaching of the Upanishads or the Pramana. So for Shankara, the language of union is inappropriate, since even under the condition of ignorance, Atman and Brahman are not, in fact, separate. I have to end my presentation. But what I would have developed is I would want to comment a little bit on Huxley's characterization of what he calls the nature of the ground, which is also a substantial chapter in his work on the perennial philosophy. And when he speaks about the nature of the ground or the nature of Brahman, he emphasizes its immanence as well as its transcendence. This is where he puts his focus. And so Advaita certainly understands Brahman to be both immanent and transcendent, present in everything, but always more than the objects and beings in which it is present. But I think that Advaita is more than just a description of the ground of being as immanent and transcendent. It is at heart a description of a relationship between this ground and everything else, which it characterizes by this beautiful expression, not two. It is not one, which would be monism, or perhaps someone would say pantheism. So it is not one, but it is not also two, which would be dualism. So there is something important in characterizing the relationship as not two, an apophatic. Falling back on an apophatic description of this relationship, which is a rejection of, which I understand to be a rejection of dualism, of pantheism, of panentheism, and I would argue in this paper also of illusionism, something to which many who advocate the perennial philosophy also move to. The language becomes also very illusionistic in description of the relationship between the one and the many. See, Advaita is more than even, I would want to say, as I said, panentheism. In a panentheistic theology, one certainly can make claims about immanence and transcendence, but still not articulate what is unique to Advaita. And what Advaita adds to panentheism is the truth of a single, undivided reality that is the ontological ground, but also the ontological nature of all that exists. It is even more than a description of an interrelated many. It is not opposed to the interrelatedness of everything, but interrelatedness is still compatible with dualism, even as panentheism is compatible with certain forms of dualism. And therefore, I would want to distinguish Advaita from all of those positions often associated with the. So let me conclude. Certainly, perennial philosophy is a grand effort to discern convergences and shared resonances among the world's religions. I found much beauty as I read Huxley, and even inspiration in his work. I found great delight in the writings of the teachers of the many traditions that he assembles as part of his exposition. But at the same time, I want to be sure that the significance of distinctive insights are not lost in the sweeping generalizations that often are associated with expositions of the perennial philosophy, because it is in these details that the beauties of these traditions, the distinctive contributions are to be found. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Brad for organizing this wonderful conference, and it's been a pleasure meeting many of you, if not all of you. We've been speaking mostly about Schuon's perennial philosophy, and some of us also Huxley's brand of perennial philosophy. So I want to introduce a third paradigm of perennial philosophy, which has some affinities with Schuon's and Huxley's, but there are also some distinctive features. And because I have very limited time, I want to focus on three distinctive features in this presentation today. So first, some background, which many of you are probably familiar with. Sri Ramakrishna was a 19th century Bengali mystic who's very unique in having practiced spiritual disciplines in a variety of religious traditions, including Tantra, Vaishnavism, Advaita Vedanta, Islam, and Christianity. And through these different practices, he had numerous types of spiritual experiences, both theistic and non-theistic. And it was on the basis of these varied sadhanas and spiritual experiences that he declared, this is one of my, he's known to have taught the harmony of religions, but this is my favorite formulation. He says, God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. Tini ananto patho ananto in Bangla. And so according to Ramakrishna, there are numerous religious and spiritual paths that are equally capable of leading us to the salvific realization of some aspect or form of one in the same infinite divine reality. And so I want to just talk about briefly today 3 of the unique features of Ramakrishna's perennial philosophy of what I call Vijnana Vedanta. I can't explain in detail why I call it Vijnana Vedanta, but I'll explain the Vijnana part of it, if not the Vedanta part. So, first unique feature, his expansive conception of divine reality as impersonal personal, as equally personal and impersonal, accommodates both theistic and non-theistic spiritual traditions. Second, his conception of ultimate salvation is correspondingly expansive. This is something that Catherine and I were discussing yesterday. He accepts the equal ultimacy and value of the theistic goal of dwelling with the personal God in an eternal heaven, and the non-theistic goal of attaining nirvana in Buddhistic traditions, or realizing one's true nature as pure consciousness in Advaitic traditions. Third unique feature, he makes an important new contribution to philosophical discourse on mystical experience. This is something that Stephen Taylor was talking about yesterday. He was criticizing aspects of constructivism and defending perennialism. And I argue that Ramakrishna defends a third paradigm, which I see as a kind of dialectical alternative to both constructivism and perennialism, which I call manifestationism. So if I have time, I'd like to talk about this manifestationist paradigm that he introduces. So first, regarding his conception of God, he teaches a very expansive understanding of God as impersonal, personal, on the basis especially of his spiritual experience of what he calls vijnana. And this is how he explains this special spiritual state. He says, the jnani, the knower of Brahman, the one who realizes his or her true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of neti neti is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. And this is the most relevant, that's why I highlighted it. The vijnani sees that the reality, which is attributeless and impersonal, nirguna, is also personal and with attributes, saguna. And there's some debate about how to translate nirguna. Some people say transpersonal. I just want to bracket that. That's fine too. A man cannot live on the roof for a long time. He comes down again. Those who realize Brahman in samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. This is known as vijnana. So, on the basis of this really unique spiritual state of realizing God both as Brahman, as nirguna Brahman, at the same time realizing the saguna aspect of the same God, he teaches that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, abheda, Brahma Shakti abhed in Bangla. By Brahman, he always means non-dual pure consciousness, nirguna Brahman. And by Shakti, he's thinking of the personal God. His own Ishta Devata was Kali. He says, Brahman and Shakti are abheda, inseparable, like fire and its power to burn. Ogni artha dahika shakti. When we talk of fire, we automatically mean also its power to burn. Again, the fire's power to burn implies the fire itself. If you accept the one, you must accept the other. In another place, he says, in a different way, but conveying the same teaching, when God is actionless, nishkriya, I call God Brahman. When God creates, preserves, and destroys, I call that same God Shakti. He says, again, one cannot think of Brahman without Shakti or of Shakti without Brahman. And finally, this gets at the heart of his religious pluralism. He says, some address the divine reality as Allah, some as God, some as Brahman, some as Kali, and others by such names as Rama, Jesus, Durga, Hari. So that's a brief discussion of the first point. Now the second point, his expansive conception of salvation. He says the following, obviously as a metaphor, bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. So I see this as affirming that there are 2 fundamentally different types of salvation for different kinds of souls. And depending on their temperament and their preferences and their whatever spiritual practices they engaged in this life, they will attain the kind of salvation that they want, basically. So Advaita Vedantins, for instance, and many Buddhists arguably want to become sugar in the relevant sense that he's thinking of, which means Advaitins want to rest in their true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. They're going to have that, according to Ramakrishna. Bhaktas, in all traditions, Christians want Christian heaven, they're going to go to Christian heaven. Muslims want to go to, I think it's called Jannah, so they'll get their Jannah. Vaishnavas want Vrajaloka, they'll have their Vrajaloka. Ramakrishnites want Ramakrishna Loka, they'll get the Ramakrishna Loka. So it's I think he envisions the structure of salvation, this eschatological structure, as a kind of many-roomed mansion. Just as, there could be a parallel conference going on in another room in the same building here. McKenna. Why can't we envision multiple salvations for different people? This is along the lines of Mark Heim's ideas when he criticizes John Hick. The problem with Mark Heim is that he collapses into a kind of inclusivism, and so I think that's problematic. So Ramakrishna, I think, was a robust religious pluralist, but he really defended a strong model of multiple salvations. So, where does he say this? I'll give you one example. Mohima Chakraborty, who was a staunch Shankarite, he was a traditional Advaita Vedantin. He had this idea that even bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, ultimately they have to go to the higher stage of Advaita, don't they? This is his question. I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? By nirvana, he means the dissolution of individuality in Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna, Nitya Krishna, is with his eternal bhaktas. Nitya Krishna tar Nitya bhakta. Krishna is spirit or consciousness embodied, and his abode also is spirit or consciousness embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal, and the bhaktas also are eternal. Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta. Oh, what happened here? Is somebody back there who's... yeah, okay. Thank you. Krishna is eternal and the bhaktas also are eternal. So he clearly says here that no, it's not the case that there's one type of salvation, that it's Advaitic in nature, and that every single soul has to attain that Advaitic state of salvation. He has a more capacious view than that, and he says that it's really a matter of preference. He says that using a different metaphor, which is I really like it, and so I just want to bring it into play as well. He says, Satchitananda, existence, consciousness, bliss, is like an infinite ocean. Intense cold freezes the water into ice, which floats on the ocean in blocks of various forms. Likewise, through the cooling influence of bhakti, devotion, one sees forms of God in the ocean of the Absolute. These forms are meant for the bhaktas, the lovers of God, the personal God. But when the sun of knowledge arises, Jnana Surya, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before, water above and water below, everywhere nothing but water. Now, up to this point, classical Advaitins will be very pleased. And they'll say, see, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, these forms melt, which means that the highest truth is, of course, Advaitic Brahman. Then the thing continues, the story continues. But you may say that for certain devotees of God, God assumes eternal forms, Nitya Shakara, Nitya Sakara. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz. And this throws a wrench into the classical Advaitic interpretation of Ramakrishna, which many monks in my order also support, but I strongly disagree with. So I take it that Ramakrishna accepts various distinct forms of salvation as equally true and equally ultimate and equally valuable, including the Christian heaven, the Muslim heaven, Jannah, various lokas, realms, these transcendental realms of theistic Hindu traditions, the Advaitic realization of non-dual pure consciousness, and Buddhist nirvana. So that, in brief, is the second unique feature of his perennial philosophy. And now I want to focus on the third because I think it's the most interesting in some ways. Philosophical approaches to mystical experience. How can Sri Ramakrishna's ideas contribute to these discussions? Mystics of various world religions have often left behind rich and fascinating descriptions of their mystical experiences. By analyzing and comparing the testimony of these mystics, many philosophers have attempted to develop a general theory of the nature of mystical experience. Any such general theory has to account for the fact that mystics have described their experiences in radically different ways. The Christian mystic doesn't describe his experience or her experience in the same way that Sufi mystics do, or that Advaitins do, or that Buddhists do. In recent analytic philosophy of religion, two competing theories of mystical experience have been especially influential. And this, as I said, was discussed by Steve yesterday, perennialism and constructivism. So let me try to bring some nuance into our understanding of both these dominant paradigms. First, perennialism. I don't think there's one form of perennialism, what Steve was calling phenomenological perennialism. I think there are at least 3 different types, but there are probably more. And I had a hard time pinning down where Steve, like which one he falls under. I'm guessing under the 3rd. So let me just rehearse quickly. One form of perennialism, the crudest, let me call it, is that all mystical experiences are the same in nature across the board. Some early 20th century figures like Radhakrishnan and Evelyn Underhill seem to defend this kind of really crude form of perennialism, which I think is patently false. The second form of perennialism, which is more nuanced, is that like certain types of mystical experience are the same across traditions. So Robert Foreman, for instance, claims that there's an experience called a pure consciousness event, which he finds in Sufi traditions and Advaitic traditions and Buddhist traditions, et cetera, et cetera. So that could be arguably more plausible as a form of perennialism. And the third type of perennialism I've seen in the literature is defended by people like Walter Stace and Ninian Smart. They argue that there's a small number of common types of mystical experience across cultures. Stace, for instance, distinguishes introverted from extroverted mystical experiences. It seems to me that the primary strength of perennialist theories of mystical experience is that there's something right about trying to find some common ground among the world's mystics. I think we can all agree about that. But what exactly the common ground is what's up for question, what's up for debate. The weakness, it seems to me, of perennialist theories is that they're unable to account for the fact that mystical experiences often differ at the phenomenological level. That just seems to be a brute fact. And in fact, Stephen Katz, in a groundbreaking essay called Language, Epistemology, and Mysticism, quoted by, I think, Adnan yesterday, he basically defends constructivism in polemical response to perennialism. And so constructivists, like Stephen Katz, but also many others, claim that mystical experiences are at least partly shaped or constructed by the mystic's own pre-experiential conceptual framework, their theological training, and so on and so forth. And again, I think that there's not one form, but multiple forms of constructivism. I think that there's some who defend an atheistic constructivism, like Wayne Proudfoot and Yuri Christo. Some, like Stephen Katz himself, I take him to defend an agnostic constructivism. He's kind of non-committal about whether religion is true or not. And then I see John Hick as a full-blown religious constructivist. The primary strength of constructivism, unlike perennialism, is that it overtly acknowledges and seeks to explain the fact that mystical experiences often differ at the phenomenological level. So I think that's a great virtue. But alas, I think that there are some serious problems with constructivism. One of them was discussed by Steve yesterday. So the first problem, constructivists are too quick to infer a causal relation from the observed correlation between a mystic's pre-experiential conceptual framework and the nature of her mystical experience. So that is, Stephen Katz says, well, look, the Christian mystic who's trained in Christian theology, lo and behold, has a vision of Jesus or of Mary or something like that. And look, the Advaita Vedantin who's trained by his guru in, as Professor Rambachan was talking about, in Advaita Vedanta, lo and behold, he has the experience of Nirvikalpa Samadhi where he's like, he realizes his true identity is Brahman. Is that a coincidence? No, it's because their theological training conditions the nature of their mystical experience. So they infer causation from correlation. But as Steve pointed out yesterday, Steve Taylor, there are some very difficult counterexamples that I think constructivists have a hard time explaining. For instance, surprising or novel mystical experiences. Steve cataloged a lot of these yesterday. How do you explain the fact that there are people acculturated and trained in a particular tradition who have wildly different spiritual experiences that even they themselves were not expecting? There are many of these kinds of cases in the literature. Second, they fail to rule out non-causal explanations of correlation. We all know that it's a fallacy to infer causation from correlation just dogmatically. So there might be non-causal explanations of the correlation. And I think Ramakrishna provides a really interesting way of understanding the correlation without resorting to the causal explanation of constructivists. Second weakness of constructivism, as I see it, is that constructivists deny the self-understanding of most mystics who take their mystical experiences to be epistemically sui generis in character. They take mystical experiences to be epistemically really, really unique, radically different from ordinary cognition. That is, mystics tend to believe that their spiritual experiences are not mediated by concepts in the way that ordinary cognitions are. And Stephen Katz just outright denies that. There's a sentence where he says that mystical experiences are mediated by concepts in exactly the way that ordinary cognitions are, and I think that mystics don't accept that. Third, constructivists end up with an ontologically deflationary account of the object, the intentional object of mystical experience, since it is at least partly a subjective construction. John Hick, for instance, in his book, An Interpretation of Religion, refers to mystics' experiences or visions of God as veridical hallucinations, which is an interesting paradox. But so you see, there's always a kind of subjective dimension to his understanding of these spiritual experiences. And I think, again, that this militates against the self-understanding of mystics who claim that what they experience has fully objective reality. So these are what I take to be the three main weaknesses of constructivism. But I also think there's a shared weakness of both perennialism and constructivism, in spite of the radical differences in other ways. Both perennialists and constructivists tend to make generalizations about mystical experience based on textual interpretation and exegesis rather than direct experience. And a number of scholars, like Ninian Smart and Fritz Stahl, and then in my previous book, I defend this method as well. We all claim that the experiential method is preferable. People who present a theory of mystical experience based at least in part on their own mystical experiences are more reliable ceteris paribus than those who have not had any mystical experiences. I take this to be fairly commonsensical, but a lot of people don't accept it. But just to give you an example, I think Fritz Stahl uses an example. He says, if somebody is trying to develop a theory of perception, sense perception, wouldn't it stand to reason that one of the sources of data would be that person's own sense experiences? Why can't we just apply that to mystical experiences as well? So clearly somebody who has had mystical experiences or thinks he has or she has will be in a better position epistemically to know about the nature of mystical experience than somebody who hasn't. So the problem here in general seems to me that many mystics have tended not to philosophize about their experiences, while most philosophers have not had mystical experiences. One major exception is Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna had a wide range of mystical experiences and defended a novel philosophical paradigm for understanding these mystical experiences. This is the paradigm I'm calling manifestationism. Let me try to flesh that out in the remaining time I have. Let me begin with a parable, which is less well known than the blind man and the elephant, which we're all familiar with, which he also used, but this is, I think, interestingly different. He says, once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal, but why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it, a very unusual man who lives under this tree, kind of activist or something. On being asked, he replied, yes, I live under this tree and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none. In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that, and this is the key, I think, God manifests himself. Actually, I was going back and changing all the himselves to herself because I think that's more accurate for Ramakrishna. I forgot this one. This is Nikalananda's translation. So God manifests herself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument. So I take it that the man sitting under the tree here represents the Vijnani, like Ramakrishna himself, who has experienced God in multiple forms. He actually had a spiritual realization of God as Jesus, merging into his own body and declaring himself to be an incarnation. He had visions of Krishna, of Rama, of Allah. And he also had the Advaitic realization. And the colorless chameleon seems to me to represent the impersonal non-dual Brahman, attributeless Brahman, or transpersonal, however you want to call it. And I see his Vijnana-based religious pluralism going hand in hand with his manifestationism. And this is that highlighted sentence captures what I call his manifestationism. God manifests himself to seekers in various forms and aspects. So the one impersonal, personal, divine reality manifests itself in various forms and aspects to mystics of different traditions and temperaments. Now, let me try to make that a little bit more concrete. It seems to me that Ramakrishna's manifestationism is based on two key principles. The first one is the principle of God as a lover of his devotees. In Bangla, the term is bhakta bachchal. It's famous in Vaishnava traditions. Ramakrishna says the following: God manifests himself or herself to the devotee in the form the devotee loves most. God's love for the devotee knows no bounds. Tini je bhakta bachchal. This key principle of God as Bhakta Vatsal explains why there is so often a close correlation between a mystic's pre-experiential beliefs about God and the nature of the mystic's subsequent experience of God. Constructivists, as we have seen, argue that this correlation implies causation. The mystic's pre-experiential concepts, according to constructivists like Katz and Hick, shape the mystic's experience. Ramakrishna, by contrast, explains this correlation from the side of God rather than from the side of the mystic. God reveals herself to each mystic in the form or aspect the mystic loves most. The cause of a given mystic's particular experience of the ultimate reality is God herself, rather than the mystic's subjective conceptual framework. That's what I take to be the key difference between manifestationism and constructivism. But he combines the principle of God as Bhakta Vatsal with another principle, the principle of God as Icchamayi. Ramakrishna accounts for surprising and novel mystical experiences. This is the kind of experience that Steve Taylor was emphasizing yesterday as a problem for constructivists. So he accounts for these kinds of experiences by appealing to a different manifestationist principle, which I call the principle of God as Icchamayi. That's his own language. It's hard to translate, but one way of translating it would be one who does everything at her pleasure. God can do whatever she wants, which complements his Bhakta Vatsal principle. Since God is Icchamayi, she sometimes chooses to manifest herself to devotees in a form or aspect that the mystic neither expects nor perhaps even wishes to realize. This explains, for instance, why God sometimes grants the Advaitic knowledge of Brahman to bhaktas, devotees of a personal God, like Sri Aurobindo, who do not seek such knowledge. Sri Aurobindo's one of his first spiritual experiences was when he was being trained by Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, who was not an Advaita Vedantin, and he had this very intense Advaitic experience of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And he said later, he said, I didn't want Advaitic experience. I was not an Advaitin, but I had it anyway. And I want to just conclude by mentioning some of what I see to be the advantages of Ramakrishna's manifestationism over both perennialism and constructivism. So first, regarding perennialism, I'd argue that Ramakrishna's manifestationist paradigm, based on the complementary principles of God as Bhakta Vatsal and God as Icchamayi, shares the main advantages of both perennialism and constructivism, but lacks their respective limitations and weaknesses. His manifestationist paradigm honors the core perennialist intuition that there's a common core to all mystical experiences. Unlike perennialists, however, Ramakrishna locates this mystical common core at the ontological rather than the phenomenological level. All mystical experiences, according to Ramakrishna, have as their intentional object one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. Since he affirms that the infinite reality manifests to different mystics in different forms and aspects, he emphatically rejects the thesis of a phenomenological common core held by perennialists like Stace and Smart. The primary weakness of perennialism is its inability to account for the fact that the experiences of mystics in various traditions, and even within a particular tradition, often differ quite dramatically, as Katz and many others have pointed out. There's overwhelming evidence that theistic mystical experience, for instance, differs at the phenomenological level from the non-theistic experience of non-dual Brahman. Ramakrishna's manifestationist paradigm is able to honor the very real phenomenological differences among various types of mystical experience, while at the same time affirming an ontological common core of all mystical experience. Now, regarding what I see as the advantages of his manifestationism over constructivism. Like constructivists, Ramakrishna maintains that there's a wide variety of mystical experiences that differ at the phenomenological level, so they're both equally at an advantage, constructivism and manifestationism. Constructivists, however, account for this diversity of mystical experiences by claiming that the mystic's pre-experiential concepts shape her mystical experiences. Ramakrishna, by contrast, maintains that mystical experiences vary because the infinite God manifests herself in different aspects and forms to mystics of varying backgrounds and temperaments. Hence, Ramakrishna is not committed to the problematic constructivist assumption that the best way to account for the frequently observed correlation between a mystic's pre-experiential concepts and the nature of her subsequent mystical experiences is to assume a causal connection between them. So he sees the causality working from God to the mystical experiences directly, rather than from the mystic's pre-experiential concepts and the experience. Constructivists are, and as we saw yesterday, Stephen Taylor talking about this, constructivists are unable to account for surprising or novel mystical experiences. By contrast, Ramakrishna's manifestationist paradigm accounts for unexpected mystical experiences by appealing to the principle of God as Icchamayi, God who can do whatever he or she wants. Therefore, his manifestationist paradigm has greater explanatory power than the causal account favored by constructivists. Moreover, constructivists adopt a subjectivist epistemology that results in an ontologically deflationary account of the divine object of mystical experience. For constructivists such as Katz and Hick, the divine reality a mystic claims to have experienced is at least partly a product of the mystic's own mind. I'm being cautious here, at least partly a product of the mystic's own mind. For Ramakrishna, by contrast, mystics experience fully objectively real manifestations of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. And finally, I think that there are hermeneutic advantages of his manifestationist paradigm over perennialism, constructivism. What do I mean by that? From a hermeneutic standpoint, the most plausible philosophical theory of mystical experience is one that provides the most convincing and comprehensive explanation of why mystics in different traditions have described their experiences in such a wide variety of ways. Taken collectively, the reports of mystics across the world strongly suggest, I think, three things. Number one, mystical experiences frequently differ at the phenomenological level. C here is an abbreviation for constructivism, M for manifestationism, and P for perennialism. So constructivism and manifestationism subscribe to one, but perennialism falls afoul of that one, right? It's not able to account for that fact. Second, most mystics take their experiences to be epistemically sui generis in character, to be epistemically unique and distinct from ordinary cognitions. They're not mediated by concepts, or they're mediated by concepts in a fundamentally different way from ordinary cognitions. Here, perennialism is, and manifestationism can help themselves to that second thesis, but not constructivism. And the third, most mystics take the divine objects of their experience to have fully objective reality. I think if you just read these mystical testimonies at face value, I think we can agree on that. And perennialism and manifestationism can accept that thesis, but not constructivism. Perennialists deny one, so one here, right, that mystical experiences differ phenomenologically. Perennialists deny one since they maintain that mystics' interpretation of their experiences often differ, but that the experiences themselves do not differ phenomenologically. Constructivists, on the other, deny both 2 and 3. Against 2, constructivists maintain that mystical experiences are always mediated by concepts in precisely the same way that ordinary cognitive experiences are. And against 3, I'm sorry if it's too much 1, 2, 3, 3 is most mystics take the divine objects of their experience to have fully objective reality. So against 3, constructivists claim that the divine realities allegedly experienced by mystics do not have fully objective reality. They have some reality, sometimes, but not fully objective reality, since they are at least partly a product of the mystic's own conceptual frameworks. Therefore, although both perennialists and constructivists claim to be maximally faithful to mystical testimony, they nonetheless deny key elements in the self-understanding of most mystics. Ramakrishna, by contrast, fully accepts 1, 2, and 3. In accordance with 1, Ramakrishna maintains that the experiences of mystics vary significantly at the phenomenological level because the infinite reality manifests in different forms and aspects to different mystics across the world. In accordance with 2, he claims that mystical experience involves a special faculty of non-discursive spiritual knowledge, which differs radically from ordinary cognition, which I think is in line with what many mystics think and believe. In accordance with 3, Ramakrishna maintains that all the various manifestations of the infinite reality experienced by mystics have full ontological reality. Thank you.
So wonderful presentations and hard to follow. 2 of my favorite scholars right here. So I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you, Brad, very much for inviting me. So moving from Sri Ramakrishna to his preeminent disciple, Swami Vivekananda, my presentation is A Universal Religion, the Perenniality of Vedanta in the Thought of Swami Vivekananda. And right at the beginning, I have to confess that as I wrote this, it actually turned into more of my own constructive project, which is heavily indebted to Swami Vivekananda more than an exegesis of Swami Vivekananda. So I'll just be open about that right from the beginning. And I started thinking about these issues many, many years ago. In fact, even before I came to Notre Dame. As Brad kindly pointed out in his introduction, I've was a student here, undergraduate, theology major, class of 91. And during the time that I was here, yes, a lot of my conversations, a lot of the things I learned led me onto the path I am now. I'm part of the same tradition that Swami Medhananda also represents. So when I'm talking about the perennial philosophy, right, it seems like there are so many meanings of what the perennial philosophy is. The concept, as I understand it, is not so much a matter of everyone, people from all traditions having the same basic experience, which Swami Medhananda has very ably critiqued, nor certainly is it the case that all religions teach the same things. The concept that I'm working from is that we all inhabit the same reality. Right? If we did not, it would be impossible for us to communicate with one another at all. And I see Swami Vivekananda as working from a very similar set of premises. So I'm operating from the premise of the universality of truth. Universality of truth here meaning the, in principle, universal availability of truth. Again, given the fact that we are all part of the same reality. And going back to the Rig Veda, ekam sat, right? Reality is one, and we are all part of it. So if we look at the sciences, right, if we look at our studies of the sensory world, there is no American physics, French chemistry, Russian biology, etc. There's physics, there's chemistry, there's biology. So certainly there are American physicists and French chemists and Russian biologists, and certainly what we now call science is arrived at through a wide array of social practices and conventions. And of course, we all know Thomas Kuhn, that it's not simply a straightforward matter of application of the scientific method. But it is fair to say that there has been convergence across the sciences on such a wide array of topics that we can now speak of a scientific worldview, broadly speaking. The premise I'm working from is that the nature of the supersensory realm should similarly be universally available to our awareness, even if it's expressed in the idioms of particular traditions. So I'm seeing many of the great saints, sages, mystics of the world as something akin to spiritual scientists. And Swami Vivekananda, again, speaks very much in this way in many of his lectures and many of his accounts. That there are not really two realms, a sensory realm and a supersensory realm. There is reality, which we access through these distinct ways, these distinct media. Of course, the famous metaphor of the blind man and the elephant, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. Swami Medhananda mentioned it as well. Sri Ramakrishna also quotes from this metaphor. In my usages of this metaphor, again, the elephant is not God or ultimate reality. It is reality in its totality. Not meaning to make that rhyme, but it just did. That it would include ultimate reality. It would include God, but it would also include this room, right? It would include our physical bodies. It would include everything that is available to our experience. So there could be certainly some objections to this premise. There are probably quite a few. I'm going to look at three. The lack of convergence across the world's religions, right? It's in the title of our conference, Converging Wisdom, ? And many would say, no converging wisdom, right? The Christians believe different things from Hindus, Hindus believe different things from Muslims, atheists believe different things from all of the above, and so on. The idea of special revelation. There is very prominently taught in some traditions the idea that the elephant has spoken. And the elephant has spoken in a particular book or to a particular group of people, and that's everything we need to know about the elephant. The disparate natures of the sensory and supersensory realms, right? Is it really appropriate to draw an analogy to suggest that just as we have a science of physics or a science of biology, that we could conceivably imagine a science of the spiritual realm? Is that just such a disanalogy that it's a crazy idea, right? So these are three objections I would like to take up. First, there is the lack of convergence, right? Just the evident fact that religions teach different things, that secular philosophies teach different things, that there is so much disagreement across the world that it's not meaningful to talk about all of these things describing something like a single reality or trying to correlate them in a way that would be akin to piecing together the perceptions of the blind men as they're grasping at the elephant. In response to this, well, again, just to restate what I was saying, that the religions and philosophies are simply too divergent and mutually contradictory for us to be able to say that they're describing a shared reality. A response to this is, well, you can find convergence, and some of the previous two speakers both mentioned Huxley. I think it's interesting that all three of us on the Hindu panel are mentioning Huxley, because Huxley's kind of one of us, right? He was a disciple of Swami Prabhavananda. He frequented the same center that Swami Medhananda, where he now resides. And his definition of the perennial philosophy is precisely this, that there is an understanding of reality, of consciousness, of ethics, that one can find repeating and echoing across traditions. And Huxley says it so beautifully in his book, The Perennial Philosophy. The metaphysic that recognizes a divine reality substantial to the world of things and lives and minds, the psychology that finds in the soul something similar to or even identical with divine reality, the ethic that places humanity's final end in the knowledge of the immanent and transcendent ground of all being. Now, of course, as Anand pointed out in his presentation, this is extremely broad. It can encompass many such metaphysical models, many such ethical systems, and so on. But there is nevertheless, one could say, a thread of resemblance that can be discerned. There is, at the same time, significant difference across religions. And as Anand also pointed out, sometimes these are the most interesting things, right? Not just the things that are shared. Swami Vivekananda was very aware of this. He was aware that a question that could be raised against the idea of what he called harmony of religions, dharma samandvaya, that this could be glossing over significant differences across religions. And what Swami Vivekananda says in a very pivotal, I think, very central presentation, which he gave in Pasadena, California, called The Way to the Realization of a Universal Religion. This is where much of, I find, his thought on this topic can be gleaned. He says, every religion has a soul behind it, and that soul may differ from the soul of another religion. But are they contradictory? Right? This reminds me of, as Professor Perry Schmidt-Leukel was saying this morning, the idea of distinct revelations, right, in the work of Schuon. And Swami Vivekananda raises the question, are they contradictory? They're different, certainly. Do they contradict or supplement each other? That is the question. He goes on to answer his own question. He says, I believe they're not contradictory. They are supplementary. Each religion, as it were, takes up one part of the great universal truth and spends its whole force in embodying and typifying that part of the great truth. It is, therefore, addition, not exclusion. That is the idea. System after system arises, each one embodying a great idea, and ideals must be added to ideals, and this is the march of humanity. Again, this is very evocative of Schuon as presented by Perry this morning, that there is, I really love that quote, that there is something that each particular religion does better than any other religion. Right? It's embodying fully this particular piece of the truth that is its province, as it were. Carrying on with the same idea, we have from a contemporary, another monastic practitioner in the Ramakrishna tradition, Pravajik of Rajaprana, who has said, the world's spiritual traditions are like different pieces in a giant jigsaw puzzle. Each piece is different, and each piece is essential to complete the whole picture. Right? Pieces of a jigsaw puzzle do not map onto each other. That's the whole point. Right? They're all a distinct shape, but they fit together. Right? They're complementary or supplementary. Each piece is to be honored and respected while holding firm to our own particular piece of the puzzle. We can deepen our own spirituality and learn about our own tradition by studying other faiths. Just as importantly, by studying our own tradition well, we are better able to appreciate the truth in another tradition. She goes on to say that a very important point that several speakers have underscored. This is not to say that all religions are pretty much the same. That is an affront to the distinct beauty and individual greatness of each of the world's spiritual traditions. And I love this metaphor she uses. Saying that every religion is equally true and authentic doesn't mean that one can be substituted for the other like generic brands of aspirin. However, are the traditions always complementary or supplementary? We can certainly talk about a core of shared ideas and practices and insights. We can also talk about a wider penumbra of genuinely different insights that are nevertheless not fundamentally contradictory to one another. There's nothing fundamentally contradictory between the Buddhist emphasis on the impermanence of phenomena and the Christian emphasis on love. Those can coexist in our minds. But as David Tracy has helpfully pointed out, one of my old teachers at Chicago, the discourses and ways of the religions can sometimes complement, or even at the limit, complete some undeveloped aspect of one another. The religions can also interrupt and at the other limit obliterate one another's claims. So what do we do when that happens? And my particular favorite example of this, on which Bradley and I have had a lot of conversation, is the question of rebirth or reincarnation affirmed in traditions like the Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions, versus the idea of one lifetime followed usually by some eternal afterlife, which is more conventional in traditions like Christianity and Islam. One could sort of engage in some mental gymnastics that would allow both of these things to kind of somehow be true, but not really, because in the end, one or the other of them is the actual destiny of the soul, and then the other becomes metaphorical or stretches in some way beyond recognition by its believers. So what do we do in a case like that? Well, I'm going to quote Swami Medhananda here. Swami Vivekananda's approach to this is the following. He finds a unity of multiple religions with respect to their fundamental claims about ultimate reality. Again, what we might find to call to be the core. At the same time, he acknowledges that religions often differ with respect to relatively minor claims about issues like rebirth, historical events, and so on. Now, here's a place where we have, again, some potential for controversy, I think, because it's the case that some of the minor issues are the things that people go to war about, right, historically. Right? I cannot think of, there may be one, if a historian in the room can correct me, I'm not aware of a war or a massive persecution or a genocide carried out based on the question of whether the divine is personal or impersonal. I just don't know of such an occasion. But whether my community has possession over this particular holy site or that community does, or who was the real prophet, or who was the final prophet, people die over those things, right? So one could dispute that those things are minor claims. I would want to reply to that response by saying that the fact that so much blood has been shed over these minor issues might suggest that it would be salutary for us to think of them as minor issues rather than investing so much of our identities and our politics and so on into these. So but now we have the author here, so Swami Medhananda can say whether I'm interpreting him correctly or not, but I'm taking him to say that from Swami Vivekananda's perspective, these are minor issues because they do not pertain to whether one attains salvation. And one can ask, what does salvation mean? And I'm delighted that Swami Medhananda's talk preceded mine, because my understanding of Swami Vivekananda is that he's very much in harmony with his teacher, Sri Ramakrishna, and saying, well, salvation means whatever it is for you, and that the universe is such that a salvific process is enabled that can take multiple forms. So Swami Vivekananda, we can say, and this is something else Swami Medhananda has also pointed out in his work, that if we think of the paradigm of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism, which I assume many of you are familiar with, Swami Vivekananda is an inclusivist with respect to truth. He believes, for example, that rebirth really does occur. But he's a pluralist with respect to salvation. What has very often happened in the conversation around those three paradigms is that theologians have often not differentiated between, say, truth and salvation. They take one to imply the other. But they're actually distinct. I might have wrong views about all kinds of things, right? As Perry was saying this morning, I might be very certain about something that turns out to be absolutely wrong. But that does not necessarily mean I'm not going to reach the ultimate goal. These two are distinct from one another. There may be issues on which one religion or philosophy has deeper insight into reality than another. I think that if we want to have a logically consistent worldview, right, that question of logical consistency came up earlier, inclusivism with regard to truth is, I believe, an inevitability. Because if you believe something is the case, then that means something that is flatly contradictory to that either cannot be the case or further dialogue needs to happen about, well, what do we mean by these sentences and so on. But part of having a coherent worldview is, in a sense, being an inclusivist. And that means that if you think, for example, that rebirth occurs, then a worldview that teaches that rebirth occurs is, in that particular respect, superior, right? It has the truth. Now, this does not negate the ability of many religions to lead their practitioners to salvation, however they may conceive of it. A worldview which acknowledges the reality of rebirth may be, in that sense, more true than other worldviews. However, there may be souls for whom belief in rebirth is not salutary. If you think of someone who becomes aware of the concept of reincarnation and then says, oh, I can put off this whole spiritual life thing and just kind of have fun for another few more lifetimes and then get serious about it later on, right? For such a soul, it's probably better to believe that you have to do it now. You have this one lifetime because otherwise you're going to squander it. Right? And the Hindu tradition has mechanisms like the teaching that a human rebirth is rare, right? You don't know when you're going to have this kind of opportunity again. But from a perspective that affirms the idea of rebirth, but also affirms the idea that people who don't believe in rebirth can get salvation, we could say that this is, it's nice to be right about something, but it does not necessarily impinge upon this question of salvation, right? That is a separate issue from whether our views about the world are always absolutely correct. The concepts of truth and salvation need to be delinked in conversations about exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. And in a recent paper, I won't go into it here, but I'll just mention it, I think there is at least one more axis too to add here about how we regard others in our social and political interactions. Right? I know people who are pluralistic with regard to salvation and maybe even truth, who are hardcore exclusivists when it comes to how they feel in real life about other human beings who are not of their religious community. This affects things like, whom you would like your daughter to marry or not, and so on. So there's that axis as well. We can be social and political exclusivists regardless of what our views might be on the issues of truth and salvation. So I think we need to pick apart exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism in this way. Another objection to this idea, well, we're all part of the same reality, and so we're maybe just all discerning different aspects of it, is the idea of special revelation. Some traditions, notably Christianity and Islam, assert that the elephant has, in effect, revealed its nature directly to the world through a particular text or other authoritative source. And in our Hindu tradition, there are similar views, of course, about the Vedas, as Anand mentioned. This is reliable information about the nature of reality. The idea that some beings might have a greater aptitude for or interest in the exploration of the spiritual realm is well taken. I've tried to find a picture here of a good student and a bad student sitting next to each other, right? So My claim is not that we should reject claims of special revelation because, everybody's equal. There are certainly people who cultivate insight and who have mystical experiences and whom one might regard as virtuosos of the spiritual life. Sri Ramakrishna, of course, being one of them. And there are people who just have no interest in any of this whatsoever. They're spiritually speaking, they're the student in the back who says, is this going to be on the test, right? So it's not that idea. But the claim here is that not that everyone has equally realized the nature of ultimate truth, but that this nature is in principle available to all, no less so than the nature of the sensory realm. Again, because we're inhabiting it, because we are surrounded by God, right? We are surrounded by spiritual reality. The idea that a particular culture or religion is privileged in this regard, though, raises, I think, grave difficulties, pointed out by John Hick. I just in the interest of time, won't read his entire quotation here, though I think it's very powerful. But he's basically saying that our religious affiliation very often is a function of where we happen to be born, where we grow up, who our family is. And so there is, as he says, a certain non-rational arbitrariness in the claim that the particular tradition within which one happens to have been born is the one and only true religion. And if the conviction is added that salvation and eternal life depend on accepting the truth of one's own religion, it may well seem unfair that this saving truth is known only to one group, into which only a minority of the human race have had the good fortune to be born. Again, I certainly wouldn't deny the potential reality of special revelation. As Sri Ramakrishna says, God can do whatever God wants. Right? The idea that any of us is excluded from that because, well, sorry, you were born on the wrong side of the world in the wrong period of history, that, I think, is deeply problematic. It raises ethical questions, I think, about the nature of God. This idea of special revelation, I think, is something that we can take very seriously. Well, okay, what is in the special revelation? But as Ramakrishna said, the wind of the divine grace is always blowing. It's up to us to raise our sail, right, to catch that wind. The idea that anyone is excluded from it, purely based on cultural location, I think is very problematic. Finally, we come to the objection about the disparate natures of the sensory and supersensory realms. Here, I confess, I'm going to sort of very superficially skate over this issue. There are deep philosophical waters here. I'm like on a water ski right at the top. But I want to give a hint as to what the full argument is. So the objection is that the supersensory realm is simply not the kind of thing that's available to human knowledge. Unlike the sensory realm, claims about it are wholly culturally relative and conditioned, and perhaps even wholly delusory. This would be the hard constructivism that Swami Medhananda was talking about. What's the response? I think one of the most important thinkers we can look to in this regard is William Alston, especially his book in the early 90s, Perceiving God. He says, we have no non-circular reason to believe that mystical practice is a reliable source of belief. That's the objection to it. But neither do we have such reason for sensory perception and for other basic secular doxastic practices, that is, practices that form our beliefs. If we want to prove that the material world is real and the sensory world is real and that sense perceptions work, what's our evidence? A big pile of sense perceptions. So mystical experience, I think, is not necessarily on such a poor footing as maybe a certain conventional way of thinking would have it. Simply because these experiences are a little more unusual, they're defined in a somewhat different way, I don't think justifies excluding them as valid sources of knowledge. So, coming back to Swami Vivekananda and where he stands on these things and how he locates Vedanta in this regard. And I have to say here that Swamiji is guilty of the very thing that Anant was talking about. He defines Vedanta very, very broadly. In fact, we're going to see him define it so broadly as to encompass everything. For Swami Vivekananda, Vedanta does not simply refer to a specific form or branch of Hindu philosophy or of explication of the text known historically as the Vedas. He was very aware of that tradition, but it was he does something different with it, which I think connects it very closely with the idea of a perennial philosophy. Veda, for Swami Vivekananda, refers to the sum total of supersensory, or in his wording, supersensuous truth. Truth is of two kinds, he says. One, that which is known through the five ordinary senses and by reasoning based thereon. That's the science part that I've been talking about. Two, that which is known through the subtle supersensuous power of yoga. And I want to suggest that yoga here can be extended to mean a wide array of doxastic practices aimed at a direct and intuitive grasp of reality. Knowledge acquired by the first means is called science, and knowledge acquired by the second is called the Vedas. He also says in the same, it's a very pivotal essay as well, and it's called Sri Ramakrishna and Hinduism. He says, the whole body of supersensuous truths, having no beginning or end, and called by the name of the Vedas, is ever existent. The person in whom this supersensuous power is manifested is called a rishi, and the supersensuous truths which that person realizes are called the Vedas. Now, what is he doing here? Right? He's doing a couple of things. One, he is addressing a long-held objection against a particular Vedic school of thought, the Purva Mimamsa school, which affirms that the Vedas are eternal. They're aparushaya, they're not man-made. That view is widely ridiculed by the Buddhists historically, by the Jains, by others. Swami Vivekananda is sort of trying to rescue the Vedas and say, well, the eternal Veda doesn't mean a set of books. It is the eternal truth, right? It's what Buddhists would call the Dharmakaya. And so he emphasizes that these truths are not confined to the text known as the Vedas, nor even to Hinduism or to India. He said these truths are widely known in many cultures, and he's speaking in the late 19th century, so he uses the term races. The books of many races, he says, these truths are available. The Hindus found their creed upon the ancient Vedas, a word derived from vid, to know. These are a series of books which to our minds contain the essence of all religion, but we do not think they alone contain the truths. All the religions mean so many attempts of the human soul to grasp and realize the infinite, each determined by the conditions of its birth and association. Again, very Schuon here, I'm thinking from Perry's presentation. And each of them marking a stage of progress. We gather all these flowers and bind them with the twine of love, making a wonderful bouquet of worship. There are a number of places where Swami Vivekananda speaks in this similar way about the diverse religions. He talks about going into the Buddhist temple and taking refuge in the Dharma, and praying before the Christian cross, and bowing down and worshiping in the mosque. And he says, going out into the forest and meditating with the Hindu. He says, I will do all of these, and he says, and I will remain open even to the religions of the future that don't yet exist. Because he sees all of us as, I believe, in the process of ever unfolding our understanding and insight into this vast and infinite reality of which we are all part. In this way, I would see him as advancing a kind of perennial philosophy. For him, it's appropriate to call that Vedanta, to refer to truth as Veda. My final comment I would want to make on this, though, is that I do not think we should see him as making an inclusivist move of the kind where he's saying, well, so everyone's an anonymous Hindu, right? Everyone's anonymously following the Vedas. He's doing something more radical. He's redefining Veda to mean something completely outside of tradition, completely outside of time and space. I cannot imagine that he would object to similar moves made in other traditions. Right? When Augustine says that which is now called Christianity has existed since before the creation. Right? I would much rather be an anonymous Christian or an anonymous Muslim or an anonymous Buddhist than, an infidel or a heretic or anything like that. Because we all have our own linguistic and culturally bound way of speaking about this ultimate truth, even as we're all attempting to discern it together. So Swami Vivekananda, in summary, he was a spiritual cosmopolitan, right? He was really attempting to articulate a view that could be as broad and as encompassing as possible. Of course, it has its limitations because language itself has its limitations. And so does time, so I think I need to stop here. So thank you very much.
So everyone, we've had 3 really fantastic presentations. Unfortunately, we don't have time now for questions and answers. We need to be back here at 2 o'clock to hear the presentation of Dr. Nasser. But we do have time for people during this interval to interact with the speakers. And that's all really we can do right now. I don't know whether we should, I don't think I want to take any time away from, unless someone has some, should I do this? No. No, I'm not going to do it. I think it would possibly cost us a lot more time. I'm very grateful that all 3 of you gave such fantastic talks. I've learned a lot, I've taken a lot of notes. I've photographed a lot as well. And fortunately, all of these presentations are recorded, and we can watch them a second time or a third time. So again, one more time, thank you so much for what you've given us today, all of you. Thank you.